Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is our sixth roundtable discussion and our third and final discussion on can we survive modernity, the great filter. So, the great filter is an attempted solution to what's called the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox was created by Enrico Fermi to explain the basic assumption is if Darwinian processes occur all throughout the universe, then why is it that we find no other forms of life, let alone intelligent life, in the universe? And it can be briefly summarized from this Wikipedia entry. There is no reliable evidence aliens have visited Earth, and we have observed no intelligent extraterrestrial life with current technology, nor has SETI found any transmissions from other civilizations. The universe apart from the Earth seems dead, Hansen states. Our planet and solar system, however, do not look substantially colonized by advanced competitive life from the stars, and neither does anything else we see. To the contrary, we have had great success at explaining the behavior of our planet and solar system, nearby stars in our galaxy, and even other galaxies via a simple dead physical process, rather than the complex, purposeful processes of advanced life. So, the filter identifies stages that an organism has to go through to reach the next level, and it's divided into 9. The first is the right star system, the right reproducing molecules, the first simple cells, the first complex cells, sexual reproduction, multicellular life, tool-using animals with intelligence, where we are now, so I guess current levels of human development, and then colonization explosion. Now, given the nature of the topic of the doomsday scenarios for modernity, only really 8 and 9 are relevant to this discussion. And the 3 that I think are most commonly associated with the Great Filter are AI, or what are called, what a lot of the AI designers call Artilex, which is basically the Terminator. AI take over and to try to wipe out humanity, that or the Matrix. Also, we see the von Neumann machine, the robot that has a program to reproduce itself by consuming materials, and it just kind of goes out of control and just consumes everything on the planet and maybe even everything in the galaxy in order to reproduce. Then we have, of course, nuclear holocaust, and then environmental degradation. So in short, one explanation is that any society, any race or civilization that develops technology able to travel the stars destroys itself before it can create an interstellar empire, in which case that's why you don't see any. Now, what we would like to talk about today is the sort of how plausible we think these doomsday scenarios are. So let's open up with the environmental collapse scenario. And I think we'll hand this one over to Keith. You're unmuted. Sorry.
Okay, it's my turn.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just sort of explain the environmental collapse scenario broadly.
Well, the environmental issues that are currently present involve a number of different kinds of things. The main issue that is being raised is the issue of climate change. Now, without getting into the science of climate change, as far as its relevance to what we're talking about, there's the view that the climate will change to the point that modern technological civilization, as we understand it, will either have to be abandoned for the sake of saving the planet from environmental catastrophe, or there will simply be a technological regression. The idea that because of environmental factors that the technological system will simply not be able to sustain itself and eventually collapse. So that's really the biggest issue as far as environmental doomsday. Now, of course, if that were to happen, if for various reasons the technological system that we see in the 21st century proved to be no longer sustainable, and we ended up having some kind of situation where we went back to pre-modern technology, the pre-industrial revolution technology, then obviously that would put the damper on a whole lot of things that we have grown accustomed to. Uh, that is modern healthcare, modern transportation systems, modern household technology, all of these kinds of things. But it would also prevent technological growth in the future, things like space colonization or any of these other things that people hope to aspire to. It would prevent the further development of biotechnology and artificial intelligence and all these kinds of things. So I guess the big issue there is this really the case? Is the environmental situation going to be one where the technological societies that we have known for quite some time are no longer able to continue to function? Now, there are people who believe this. We talked about Ted Kaczynski on a previous program. Now, he is probably one of the more well-known and extreme proponents of this point of view. But the idea that he raised is that technology is going to be so destructive to the ecology that for human life to continue, the technological system will have to be abandoned. There are plenty of other people who are perhaps not as extreme as Kaczynski, but they do argue that technological regression will either take place on its own just through changing circumstances, or due out of necessity, that we're just going to have to do away with fossil fuels and things like that. Now, I tend to not be as much of an environmental doomsday type of person as some of these kinds of scenarios describe. I tend to think that technology is likely going to continue to advance for quite some time and continue to be used for quite some time and increasingly become more sophisticated. As far as environmental factors, I do think that there will be shifts in technologies in the sense that we probably will over time become less dependent on fossil fuel and start using nuclear energy or start using solar energy or geothermal energy or something like that much more frequently. But I'm skeptical as to whether we will abandon technological civilization altogether. I tend to think the opposite will happen. Technological expansion will continue. Now, whether we will ever reach the point where we have these science fiction scenarios where humans are actually colonizing space and creating space colonies, and or we have robot armies that do all the work and then humans just sit back and reap the benefits, that I'm a little bit more skeptical of. It may happen or it may not, but it remains to be seen. But I'm not convinced that technology is going to be the destruction of human civilization or human societies.
Yeah, when it comes to the question of environmental collapse as a result of technology, I think there's sort of two things to untangle. There's the one, the sort of more shrill doomsday, literally everything's going to be destroyed environmental message, like the one they had at Copenhagen, 10 years ago or so. And then there's a more modest claim that certain kinds of technologies have certain kinds of undesired ecological externalities, if not properly taken care of. And we sort of see what can happen when industrial civilization doesn't take that into account with the former Soviet Union. The Rand Corporation did a report on the ecological destruction in the former Soviet Union. It was pretty bad. Half the water was undrinkable. Half the air was really unbreathable. But that's a worst case scenario that really might only happen today in China. I don't think it would happen anywhere else at this point. The more anthropocentric global warming, I'm mostly skeptical of it for the point that nobody actually believes it. If you really believe that water levels are going to rise such in 10 years that New York City and Miami are going to be underwater, then you'd sell all of it right now and you'd leave. All of these corporations that are selling us this line about anthropocentric global warming live in regions that they predict their headquarters are in regions that they predict will be over flooded within 10 years. I mean, Al Gore is buying seaside real estate. Sell it. I mean, dude, it's going to be useless in 10 years, right? I mean, what was it call it? People talk, but money walks. So it's like, no, you don't actually believe that. I don't think that's actually the most important reasoning from my point of view to be skeptical of this. The other reason to be skeptical of it is it's all tied up in a sort of global government scheme. When Obama was president, people like Alex Jones exposed his science czar Holdren, who wrote Eco Science, where he wanted to have a global communist Chinese party style regime based on having one child per couple, how much food you get to eat, even more draconian than China, because, I mean, to my knowledge, China doesn't tell you how much you're allowed to eat. And there seems to be a conflict of interest there. And then furthermore, there's questions about the reliability of the data, like the famous hockey stick that Al Gore used, which, I mean, again, it totally ignores the little ice age that happened in the 19th century and the warming that happened in the 15th century, or the cooling, rather, that happened in the 15th century. Because, in the year 1000, you could grow grapes in Norway. That seems kind of crazy today, but it was a lot warmer 1,000 years ago. So, and I think also when it comes to technology's effect on the environment, and this is something that I think I'll let segue into Swithin, it seems to create a Marxian fallacy. So Mises points out that the iron law of wages was fallacious because it assumed that man was like an animal. So in the natural environment, if an animal starts consuming too much food, the carrying capacity of the environment is exceeded, and then the surplus dies off. But workers, as Mises pointed out, aren't like animals. They can use their reason to solve problems. So I actually think that's a nice segue for you, Swithin. What are some of your thoughts on the environmental doomsday scenario?
Well, firstly, I think it is highly unlikely, at least with respect to global warming, basically because the major evidence that is used to justify the catastrophic future is always computer models who always predict what future temperature increases will be, and they are always wrong by a huge margin. They predict like 2 or 3 degrees, and it's like a half. None of the predictions ever work, and it's all computer modeling. It is not actual science. It is just prediction. And I could go at length as to why economic prediction models are, pretty much always terrible. And similar criticisms are clearly at play when it comes to the climate predictions, because they're just always wrong. They're just constantly wrong. But whenever a new study comes out, oh no, the world is going to end because it's getting slightly warmer. It's just consistent, and if you held them to the same standards of any other prediction in any general science, they would be laughed out of the academy. But they aren't. With respect to technology, and so with respect to technology in the environment, I think a crucial point to make, which is one that Alex Epstein makes, is that technology, we have always used technology to modify the environment so it's better for human habitation. I mean, if you didn't have modern technology or houses, heating, air conditioning, irrigation, all these sort of man-made technologies which have altered the environment, human life would basically be incredibly difficult, shortish, and harsh. Humans use technology to modify the environment so they can actually live in it. So, for example, I mean, like places like Las Vegas simply could not exist without modern technology, at least not to the same scale. So always arguments about, oh no, the climate is changing. Well, humans are always adapting to the climate, and they're always using resources, technology to improve it. So, okay, let's suppose that the climate does change in a particular way. Well, I see no reason why, even if it was becoming warmer because of, say, fossil fuels, etc., that we couldn't modify the environment in a certain way to take that change into account. So, I mean, it might require movements of certain peoples, or it could mean better flood defenses. It could mean various propositions of like seeding clouds so it rains over the sea, etc., is a possibility. But the crucial point is humans need technology to modify the environment so it's habitable for comfortable human existence. So to kind of go, oh no, technology is kind of bad, which I think Bill McKibben, who had a debate with Alex, who's an environmentalist, basically argues, yeah, fossil fuels really good until about 100 years ago, and then they became bad. It's like, really, Bill? Really? They had all these negative effects just now, but previously they were okay. The environmentalists have a very schizophrenic attitude when it comes to technology in general, which I think explains why their antipathy towards certain forms of nuclear. Because pretty much, or at least from what I've read about thorium, it kind of ticks all the boxes for the environmentalists, yet very few of them will tick it. Probably because they somehow have the inner anarcho-primitivist, but they generally don't out that, at least clearly in most cases. So the doomsday scenario with climate change I simply don't see. Secondly, even if it was, we could probably solve it to some extent with technology. And thirdly, this kind of technology which modifies the environment for human existence has always existed, and humans will always use it because it makes life better.
Okay. Roman Nations, what are your thoughts on environmental doomsday scenarios?
Well, I think that while I'm not a scientist, and I'm certainly not a climate scientist, it seems to me that the general argument seems to be from the consensus of the scientific community. Now, this seems to me rather curious, given that the scientific community, insofar as they mean the scientific community that's putting forward the narrative of man-made climate change, are not really behaving like people who are telling the truth at all. If you look at the 1970s, there was a scientist named Stephen Schneider, who was on board with something called global cooling, which for a brief time made the same kind of claims of consensus. And there was a big petition given to the Nixon administration that indeed we had to alter our behavior because modern civilization might bring on disastrous global cooling. Now, this same fellow would later go on to become an ardent anti-global warming activist. Whereas the man who was Al Gore's mentor, who initially was the one to start picking up on the pattern of global temperatures rising, his name is Roger Revelle, what today would be called a climate skeptic, well into the period that Al Gore was claiming that indeed that the time for discussion is over. Now think about that. A topic that is first introduced to the public with the introduction, the time for discussion is over. It would be one thing if they came to the table and said, we think there might be something to this whole climate change phenomenon, and we want to have this discussion about it in the eye of the public. Instead, what they said is, no, we have consensus on our side, believe it. And this goes back right to the first institution of the IPCC that Todd had mentioned in 1988, when they basically, James Hansen and Al Gore had the first big press conference in Congress. And there are some hilarious stories from the journalists that they actually made sure to turn the temperature up so that Gore and Hansen would look sufficiently warm for the cameras. And from the beginning, the IPCC's mission statement was to basically address the need for responding to climate change. That is, it was not an investigatory body. And so in this sense, as Swithin says, it doesn't really stand up to, it doesn't admit of any kind of process of devil's advocacy. They don't really seem to have ever been interested in having a discussion about it. So to say that the time for discussion is over is rather disingenuous, given that I don't think that they ever admitted for a time of discussion. With respect to consensus, the reason that there would appear to be a consensus on climate change is because every time that there is a scientist of any rapport who is skeptical about man-made climate change, he is then dismissed as being a serious scientist. Richard Lindzen, who was a prestigious professor, climatologist at MIT, was kind of just dismissed as a contrarian. The fellow I'd mentioned, Roger Revelle, was basically talked over. So in other words, it really is an official narrative that is being put forward. And so I would say that these people have really done nothing to merit being taken seriously or as anything other than liars, because they've only ever behaved like liars. Now, to briefly touch on the other two things you mentioned, the Fermi paradox, I'm not all that concerned about, because I think that I don't really accept the premise of the Fermi paradox as a paradox. I don't really see it as a paradox because I think that, A, it assumes that insofar as there is more intelligent life, that for some reason it's more intelligent than we are, or somehow competitive with our own intelligence, which comes from the fact that I think in science fiction films that the aliens are always portrayed as being more advanced. And secondly, given the size of the universe, as is attested to in the Monty Python song and the meaning of life, and based on pictures that I've seen and so forth, it would seem that it's not really a surprise that even if there are more sophisticated alien civilizations, why would we assume that they ever would come into contact with us? There's a lot of space there. So I don't really accept it as a paradox. With the third thing that you'd mentioned, artificial intelligence. Well, artificial intelligence in doomsday scenarios is always presented as some kind of artificial consciousness. But since we know exactly that the performance of sophisticated technology, of artificial intelligence, is behavioral. Scientists have not managed to reproduce consciousness. It kind of reminds me of the philosopher John Searle, who was trying to address this idea that technology is in danger of competing with us as a conscious, sentient being. Well, that's not true, because he sort of gave the example of, it's called the Chinese room, of someone, if you had somebody who had a perfect model for translation, they received Chinese manuscript from one window in a room that they're sitting in. Then they go through the instruction manuals in a book and they don't understand a word of Chinese, right? And if they follow these rules, they perfectly are able to translate it into Chinese, and then they hand the English manuscript out the other window. Does that mean that they understand Chinese? Well, no, it means that a mechanism is in place that's able to reproduce a conscious kind of imitate a conscious understanding of Chinese, but it's not really conscious. And what's funny is that Searle said, when he put this to the people who argue that behavior equals consciousness, they actually claimed that the room was conscious, rather amusingly. So I don't believe that we have really gotten to the point where we can replicate consciousness. It seems to only exist in animals. So that would be my thought on that. So overall, I'm not really that much of a believer in doomsday scenarios that involve excesses of civilizational development.
Now, the next and probably one of the most common in media and even in discussion would be an element of a doomsday scenario would be nuclear holocaust, or more broadly speaking, NBC, nuclear, biological, or chemical. So between 1949, when the Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon, up until the end of the Cold War, nuclear holocaust was generally considered the doomsday scenario. As biological chemical weapons became sufficiently sophisticated and being much cheaper to produce than nuclear weapons, falling in the hands of terrorists, that also became a threat. And then the question is, as far as if the total nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union had been detonated, that would have been catastrophic. And I don't think anybody would deny that that would have been a catastrophic turn of events. But the question is, even in light of things like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the things like the Able Archer experiment, war game that almost turned deadly, what's the actual likelihood that we would press the button? Which, granted, probably wouldn't end all life, but it'd be really bad for those of us that survived. I think that that's probably the most plausible great filter scenario, that we just blow ourselves up. But also, it hasn't happened yet. And we did navigate the Cold War, which makes me wonder, maybe if the rational choice theory is correct, even people that don't share the same values we do still at least desire to live. And that desire to live allows them to make rational choices, even when both sides are nuclear armed. I'll toss this one over to you as well to start with, Swithin. So what are your thoughts on nuclear holocaust or biological weapons wiping us out?
I think it's more plausible than the general climate or AI doomsday scenarios. I think the conditions in which it would possibly work is if you had various competing Gnostic or quasi-Gnostic groups who believe that we don't really care about the material, it's all about the spiritual or the immaterial. And so, if you blow everybody up, they're wrong anyway, so it doesn't really matter. That's the most plausible scenario. So I suppose in contemporary kind of situations, the most closely related to that's probably various forms of radical Islam who might decide, we will push the button for Allah. But that would need to be replicated over a much larger region to make a huge dent. And even in those regimes where they may wish to push the button, they do seem to be more sort of earthly orientated than their official theology might indicate. So, for example, all the sort of, or pretty much most of the Middle East, for example, the leadership tend to be at least somewhat rational in their actions. It's so, for example, the whipping boy, the Americans, at the moment, the Iranians seem perfectly rational bunch of as a government, insofar as they're doing things in the interests of Iran. They're pretty predictable in certain respects, and in the same way that Kim Jong-un is as well. The types of people, and I suppose he's the one that's most bandied about for sort of potentially firing on at least South Korea, which, to be fair, is reasonably plausible in certain scenarios, certainly not anywhere else. But it seems, at least for the moment, the people who have got access to significant arsenals, because of the huge destruction that it would cause, possibly retaliatory on them, that they just don't see it in their interest. I can conceive of a small sort of terrorist group or ISIS or whatever using it, but I just don't necessarily see anybody who would respond in the same way to sort of kick off a chain of multiple firings which destroy a quarter of a third of the globe. So whilst it's plausible, at least for the foreseeable 50, 100 years or so, I simply don't see it as any reasonably probable event.
Okay. Keith Preston, your thoughts on the NBC apocalypse?
Well, I actually think that one of the positive benefits of the advent of nuclear weapons is that it has raised the cost of interstate war to the point where such wars have become cost prohibitive. World War II was the biggest war in world history. It killed something like 3% of the world's population at the time. And it was in World War II that atomic weapons were first developed and used. And ever since then, there really hasn't been any more warfare on the level of World War II. I mean, there have been regional wars. One of the biggest ones was probably the war in Vietnam. But other than that, these kinds of large-scale interstate wars have largely subsided. And I think the main reason for that is what I just said, and that is that the advent of nuclear weapons has made warfare on that level cost prohibitive. Nobody dares initiate or seek out something like that because they know what the potential consequences might be. If we look at different powers around the world that have nuclear weapons, as Swithun said, all of them are powers that seem to be rational actors in the sense that none of them want to be obliterated in a nuclear holocaust. I've tended to think in the past that with the present state of nuclear development, if there ever was a nuclear exchange, it would probably be between India and Pakistan. I think that those two are probably the biggest risk for a nuclear catastrophe, given that those are two countries that have a bitter rivalry, that they're both nuclear armed. Although I see no evidence that the leadership of either country is self-destructive on the level that would involve a nuclear exchange. In fact, even when it comes to some of these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS and groups like that, it's often thought, well, surely if they got a nuclear weapon, they would use it for catastrophic purposes. I'm not quite as certain about that because I don't know that that really jives with their theological views. The theological views that the jihadist groups, these particular types of jihadist groups, hold to is somewhat deterministic in the sense that they think ultimately there's going to be this worldwide caliphate that under the rule of Allah, and they see themselves as paving the way for that. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of futuristic utopia on Earth, or what they think is a utopia, is not really compatible with the desire to destroy the world. Carrying out suicide missions where somebody straps a bomb to themselves or flies a plane into a building or something is not something that's going to destroy the world. It's just simply a massacre of infidels. I think that even those kinds of groups would be far more averse to the actual use of nuclear weapons, or creating a scenario where nuclear weapons may be used against them than what people often think. In fact, nuclear proliferation, there are currently 9 nuclear armed countries. Let's say nuclear proliferation continues and more countries become nuclear armed. That, I think, in some ways, I think has the effect of creating a peacekeeping scenario. Here's an analogy I'll use. I once saw an interview with a former inmate of Alcatraz, which was a maximum security prison in the United States in the between the 1930s and 1960s, and it was where they kept all the super bad guys. And this inmate said that, interestingly, Alcatraz was one of the safest places on Earth to be. And the reason for that is that he said that if you have a nuclear weapon and I have a nuclear weapon, we're going to be polite to each other. And what he was using nuclear weapons as an analogy, but what he meant was that these were all bad people who were used to fighting and killing and things like that. And everyone knew that. Everyone knew who their opponents were. Everyone knew that their opponents, were the types of people who wouldn't think twice about killing them if it came right down to it. And that in turn had the ironic effect of keeping the peace because everybody knew what the consequences were of starting something. And I think that nuclear proliferation on an international scale tends to have that kind of effect. Everybody knows what the consequences are of a nuclear exchange, and therefore no one wants one. Even if they don't care what they do to their opponents, they don't want that inflicted on themselves. And I think that's true even of groups like these these Takfiri groups, like ISIS and Al Qaeda. I think their theology and their general worldview conflicts with that as well. So I tend not to be quite as concerned about nuclear exchange as many people are. In fact, I think in many ways it may have the long-term effect of making warfare, of controlling warfare to a much greater degree.
Okay, Red Ruminations, what are your thoughts on the NBC apocalypse?
Well, I agree largely with what was just said, because it calls to mind an article written by the Serbian nationalist Srđan Trifković, who's a writer for Chronicles magazine, who's a kind of right-wing traditionalist, certainly not all that much of an advocate of modernity, but he said that basically we need more nukes, that indeed a kind of unprecedented era of peace, at least with respect to developed nations, seems to have been brought about by the nuclear age. My response to militarists or globalists, whenever they're talking about the dangers of Iran getting its hands on, say, a nuclear weapon is, well, of course they want to get their hands on a nuclear weapon. That does not necessarily mean that they have an interest in fighting any kind of crusade with it, but rather that they probably want the same kind of immunity to being attacked by other nation states that all nuclear weapon-bearing nations seem to possess. Also, I think that while I can understand on a visceral level the distress at having so many weapons of mass destruction in the world, I think that it is true that we don't know what will happen in the future, that indeed there could be some kind of unprecedented nuclear holocaust. After all, a century is not really that long to know how humans behave long term in possession of nuclear weapons. But the reality is that disarmament on a large scale is actually a horrible idea, because not only will it result in, first of all, even if it were possible, it would lead to the result of a restoration of kind of pre-nuclear levels of military antagonism. But secondly, they'll always be out there now. So, for example, if let's say you could get every nation state to disarm itself, that would mean that only rogue states, or only that the only people who would end up getting their hands on such a device would be people who were not willing to abide by those rules. In other words, the only antidote to nuclear weapons going forward is the development of defense technology. I think, and it's kind of odd, the people who, at risk of sounding somewhat neoconservative-ish here, it's kind of odd the people who would ever be against the development of nuclear defense systems. The only way that nuclear disarmament could ever be a plausible response to the reality of nuclear weapons is if we could all forget how to produce them and that they ever existed. As long as there are some people with them, any state that wishes to be secure is going to wish also to have them. I see it as just a paradigm shift. It's an inevitability. And so in that sense, I think the next step is to focus on missile defense systems. And I think that, to be honest, defense systems in general might be something that's going to necessarily accompany any kind of political reality going forward. So, for example, let's say we were to introduce a lot of the systems that are being proposed right now, like some kind of anarchic system, or pan-anarchism, like Keith often suggests, or any of these kind of independent visions of independent states, like some libertarians advocate. Any kind of post-globalist vision will necessarily hinge on the development of defense systems for smaller states, that there is no decentralization in the modern world without not only nuclear defense, but sophisticated degrees of technological military defense in general. And so to me, that seems like the only really plausible response to the nuclear age. Certainly not to reduce or to eliminate the possession of nuclear weapons or arms, because that will simply lead to the vulnerability of the states that don't have them against those that do. And I think that we would have to ask ourselves very carefully if we would want that, even if it were possible, given the kind of unprecedented age of peace that we live in. It seems to me like a sensible response of both maintaining the current paradigm and its conveniences, along with mitigating some of the more fearful or disastrous outcomes, is to invest more in high-tech defense and computer defense systems and things of that nature, which hopefully might even in a certain eventual scenario lead to the ability to reduce actual military spending overall, so that these martial conflicts can become even less necessary or plausible.
The last doomsday scenario, earlier you kind of hinted at it, right? Ruminations is robotics, not just, of course, artificial intelligence, but also the von Neumann machine, popularized in modern culture with the Stargate television series, The Replicators. So the von Neumann machine is it's not necessarily an artificial intelligence. It's a series of robots that have been programmed to reproduce themselves by consuming materials around them. And if they sort of reach a critical mass, then they can't be restrained, and they just consume everything on the planet or everything in the galaxy. And then there's, of course, the artificial intelligence, which, I've mentioned this elsewhere. I'm not entirely impressed with the arguments for artificial intelligence, but that's the other threat. Now, as to the two threats, I think that the artificial intelligence is weak, because I basically think that they make a metaphysical mistake. They assume sort of strictly materialist worldview. I think some of us here do as well, but I would tend to argue that strict materialism is not correct, and that there is a sort of immaterial component to consciousness. Call it the soul, the mind, whatever you want to call that. No machine could ever get that. Humans can't create a mechanism that has that property as well. So it's DOA. I just don't see artificial intelligence. It's based on a philosophical concept that I don't think is correct. The gray goo, I think the biggest objection to something like the gray goo or the von Neumann machine is something like conservation of energy and friction. Eventually the unit gain cost that this organism would gain would become so great that it wouldn't allow it to reach to be what it was before. It's like a living organism that could eat food and then regrow cells and then come back. It's like diminishing returns. Eventually, it's going to get so big that the effort to consume something will not actually replenish its resources, to the point where it eventually burns out like a fire. I don't know when it would burn out, even if you could build a machine that sophisticated. But those would be my two objections to the sort of techno-futurist doomsday scenario of AI or the gray goo. So I'll hand it back to you, Swithin. What are some of your thoughts on
that? Firstly, with the von Neumann machine, it just strikes me as odd that, we can create this great technology which in the future will cause great harm and be massively powerful. And then I just think to myself, well, surely if we had the technology to create that to begin with, we can surely get something approximating it to stop it. It just seems very sort of schizophrenic. Oh, we can do this. Oh, yeah, but we can't do anything to stop it. It just, in a way, it sort of lacks imagination. That, oh, yes, we can create this machine, but then we'll have no way of stopping it, even though we got to a level at which we could create it to begin with, but when we have absolutely no way of preventing the replicators going around the stargates, etc. So it just seems highly implausible that you would be able to get to that level of technology and then have something get away from you so badly that you wouldn't have at least anything to mitigate it. It's kind of the absurdity of kind of, oh, well, society has just gone down this really, really narrow version of the tech tree, and we've come to this, and we haven't had any of the sort of related or similar technological developments because we're so specialized in this one way down this sort of turn-based strategy game tech tree. It just seems massively implausible that that would take place. With respect to AI, I would agree with you on the metaphysical point, but I don't even think you need to take an anti-materialist line necessarily. The issue with artificial intelligence is that unlike animals, who you can determine whether they're functioning correctly or properly or not without reference to humans. So we can know what a good cow is, a good lion. We know what it is to be a lion, what a healthy one is. And obviously we'd have to interact with it to know what those properties were, but they're not. But the truth of those statements aren't dependent on humans. Unlike with artificial intelligence and computers, etc., there's no inbuilt directedness within the whole. It's just an agglomeration of various different bits, and the only way that you know whether it's working correctly or not is by using a human intelligence to determine whether it's working or not. So it's an entirely inert object. It doesn't have the internal structure that you can see in biological life forms, and you can see, oh, right, okay, this is inbuilt and programmed to do a certain thing. That simply doesn't exist in the fact it needs to be imposed by an external intelligence or an external being shows that itself, it doesn't have any. So intelligence with respect to robots, etc., is disanalogous to human or even animal intelligence. And this is a point that Ed Feser makes in quite a few of his previous blog posts with respect to sort of the Turing test, which I think has RR pointed out, the Chinese room experiment would pass the Turing test, but it still doesn't mean that the Chinese room has any sort of intelligence, or the person within it does. So I see AI as a complete non-starter in its fully fledged sort of form, and the technological doomsday one, I just don't see one form of technology developing so much that there isn't at least any other form of technology that can attempt to mitigate its problems.
Okay, Keith Preston, AI and the von Neumann machine.
Well, I would have some of the same objections to some of these doomsday scenarios involving artificial intelligence that Swithun just raised, and that is these kinds of machines only have the capabilities that humans create for them. As for the idea of actually recreating human intelligence, whether you believe human intelligence is something metaphysical or whether you believe it's something that's merely organic, it's also something that can't necessarily be recreated in its original form. It's the same kind of problem you run into with something like human cloning and things like that. You know, there are some, I think some of the same kind of limitations are there as well. But as far as these kinds of scenarios where artificial intelligence it proliferates to the point that it gets out of human control and takes over the world and things like that, the closest thing that I could see to something like that actually happening would be system malfunctions when it comes to a lot of things that are automated. Like right now, there's discussion of the possibility that some years into the future, automated trucks may be the big thing. And instead of having all of these delivery trucks that we see on the highway being driven by humans, perhaps they'll be automated. They'll be driverless trucks. Or there's this idea of we're going to have driverless cars. So if you call an Uber, a driverless car shows up and takes you where you want to go. Or perhaps that could be extended to the point where we even have pilotless airplanes or something of that nature at some point. Now, any of these kinds of technologies are only as good as the people who design and maintain them, and they're certainly prone to malfunction of some kind. So it's theoretically possible, and in fact probably plausible or likely, that at some point in the future, if we have all of these automated machines doing things, that some of them, at least some of the time, could malfunction and create problems. A pilotless plane could crash, or a driverless truck could go off the highway or cause an accident. And that would also be true of something like robots. If we have robots running assembly lines, making cars or whatever they would be doing, it's certainly possible that there could be a system malfunction, and the robotic technologies could do something that was dangerous to human life or human existence or something like that. But it would also seems like it would be possible to correct that simply by shutting it down, simply by shutting down the mechanisms that are being used to maintain these systems. It would be no different than simply turning off your computer or something like that. So the idea that somehow artificial intelligence is going to advance to the point where robotic creatures that have superhuman intelligence are going to take over the world and enslave mankind and things like that seems extremely far-fetched.
All right, elimination.
Well, I think that with respect to the question of technology's insufficiency to basically motivate itself, I think is an incredibly important point to isolate, because the way I would put it is to use the Aristotelian language: man is the efficient cause of technology. In other words, unlike with animals or plants or really any kind of natural phenomenon, technology is inanimate, independent of man actually pulling the lever, whatever the lever may be in a given situation. So it's always really, and really it does seem to be the case in general with these technologically based doomsday scenarios, that there is a misapplication of, or a misattribution of, a kind of internal efficient cause to what are really inanimate objects, which is a neat distraction from the threat posed by actual human beings, in particular the human beings putting forward these doomsday scenarios, who actually are self-motivating, who actually do have potentially sinister intentions. And it's funny that the threat actually posed by the people postulating the doomsday scenarios is not taken nearly as seriously, especially when there are such obvious motivations for the acquisition of power. I think with respect to what Swithin was saying about not necessarily having to go down a materialist line of thinking in order to disprove the AI doomsday scenario, I would agree. However, I don't necessarily think that the people who are postulating a threat from artificial intelligence are necessarily anti-materialist. It's rather that since they bypass the whole question of consciousness altogether, they assume that inanimate objects are just as potentially dangerous as human beings. So, for example, if you have a vehicle that can travel just as fast as a human, because they kind of, in a sense, they're almost anti-metaphysical, because they're anti-metaphysical to the point of basically thinking that because the vehicle runs fast enough that it's therefore some kind of threat to the ego of the human being seems to me to be reflective of a kind of misapplication of intentionality to, as I said, inanimate objects. So it's not that one would need to either condemn a materialist point of view or take up a materialist point of view in order to rectify one's understanding of technology, but rather simply stop confusing behavioral empirical evidence for consciousness. And that might sound like a kind of tangential or trivial issue, but it's not, because you actually have real philosophers like Daniel Dennett who are actually saying because a robot behaves a certain way, it therefore possesses a commensurate conscious understanding. And then I think that when people watch things like science fiction, this kind of philosophical understanding filters into the mind of the popular culture, leading us to believe that civilizational or technological advancement is a greater threat, when in fact it's the people who are hiding behind the smokescreen of these doomsday scenarios who actually are intelligent, conscious actors who I think are the more tangible and credible threat to mankind, whether they're global warming advocates or anti-AI or what have you.
Now, nearing the end of the episode, I think I would like the final statements to be sort of framed in light of the entire series. Is modernity survivable? I guess what I would say is it probably is survivable to some extent. I don't know if the conditions as we have them now persist. Some of the concerns that I've mentioned earlier, I think, would become amplified. But again, humans don't stay in a state of material conditions in the same place forever. They eventually change. So some future kind of modernity might develop that's substantially different, that would allow us to flourish more effectively. So, Swithin, final statement: can we survive modernity?
Yes. I don't see the technological critique of, say, Kaczynski, as we discussed a few weeks ago, as being a necessary, insurmountable problem. The environmental doomsday, I don't see. The economic, so the Marxist critique of capitalism, it fails. I think the general sort of post-industrial society that we live in is clearly survivable. That said, it doesn't mean that there aren't any problems associated with it. The sort of uprootedness of communities, the increase in potential for state repression with technology, potentially the lack of human interaction that people might have when everything is mediated by technology, or I mean, for a simple example, someone used to go to the shop and buy something, talk to the shopkeeper. Now you could use might be replaced with automated checkouts, those kind of things. So there are issues with current modern society and increasing class divisions that sort of Heath mentions with sort of the neoliberalism that we currently have. But I don't see in principle why it's not survivable, and actually probably provides some tools to actually solve the problems that it's kind of created.
Okay, Keith, can we survive modernity?
Yes, I think we can. The situation that we have now in the world is, I think, very similar to what it was 200 years ago, when the process of industrialization and the market revolution and all of that were first starting to come into full fruition. If you go back and look at what critics of industrialization and critics of the rise of commercial society and all of that were saying, say, 200 years ago, you see that it was actually very similar to what's being said today. For example, you had people like Malthus who were saying, well, the human race is going to get to the point where it can't feed itself anymore, and people are going to start dying off. There was a lot of concern about the impact of industrialization on organic societies and the loss of traditional ways of life. There were concerns about the impact of technology and where that would take us as well. And those kinds of critiques of modernity have survived for 200 years, even as things have actually continued to improve. If we look at the world, the data from around the world, what we see is that the human condition has improved dramatically during modernity, and particularly in recent decades. We see that over 1 billion people have been lifted out of abject poverty around the world since the late 20th century. We see that on a general level, health standards and living standards and life expectancy and things like that are starting to rise. We see education levels are starting to rise. Now, that's not to say that there's not a lot of negatives as well. We've also seen nuclear proliferation. We've seen the advent of modern military technology that makes warfare potentially more destructive. We also see right now in the United States, in particular, we see the widening class divisions that are happening, and we see deterioration in certain sectors. For instance, we look at what's going on in California with the explosion of the homeless population. In the United States today, life expectancy is actually decreasing. So there are problems, but I don't think that any of this signifies the end of modern civilization or the end of modernity. And I don't see any of these doomsday scenarios that have been described previously, whether it's nuclear holocaust or the world being overrun by rogue artificial intelligence or climate change or any of these things putting an end to modernity.
All right, right, ruminations. Can we survive modernity?
Yes, I think that the nature of these doomsday scenarios, basically all of them, is a kind of magic trick. It's basically somebody pointing to a given drastic, disastrous scenario where they basically pursue the acquisition of power by pointing to by distracting the public's attention away towards some potential danger in order to distract from the fact that the power that they want to acquire by utilizing that threat is in fact the real and most present danger. To summarize, with respect to climate change, well, we know that the consensus is a lie. And we know that they are not behaving in a way that's compatible with the dispassionate devil's advocacy scientific method. The AI problem is predicated on a philosophical misunderstanding. And the nuclear question is clearly, the pursuit of that line of questioning is clearly motivated by a desire to basically monitor other nations who are accused of desiring to possess nuclear arms. And so for that reason, I would say that we don't hear all that much about the problem of an imminent alien invasion. But I would say that if you ever do start hearing the state or large corporations or anyone start to talk seriously about that, at that point, reach for your wallet because they're probably hoping to get something out of it.
Well, all right. Thank you all for showing up. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.